You are on your knees in the sand, and you have just cut your own wrists. You are not afraid, you are calm. You have made a decision the way an athlete makes a decision, logically, with a plan, with a reason. If you're going to die out here anyway, better to die now in the shade of this crumbling stone tomb, where someone might eventually find your body. Better that than dying slowly, alone, buried under a dune where no one will ever look. You lie back, you wait. And then morning comes, and you are still breathing. Your blood was too thick to drain. Your own body, wrung dry by 6 days without water, refused to let you go. This is the true story of a man who ran into the world's harshest desert as an athlete and walked out of it 9 days later as something else entirely. This is the story of Mauro Prosperi. Most people assume the hardest part of being lost in the desert is the heat. It is not. The heat is what kills you last. Before that comes the thirst that turns your own mouth into a stranger's. Before that comes the silence that starts playing tricks on your mind. Before that comes the moment you realize the compass in your hand is useless, because there is nothing left to point it at. In April of 1994, none of that had happened yet. Mauro Prosperi was 39 years old, a former Olympic pentathlete and a police officer from Sicily, and he was exactly where he wanted to be, deep in the Sahara, running the Marathon des Sables, widely called the toughest footrace on Earth. 6 days, 155 miles, full self-sufficiency. Competitors carry their own food and sign a form stating where their body should be sent if they don't make it back. Prosperi's wife, Cinzia, thought he'd lost his mind training for it. He told her the worst that could happen was a sunburn. He was in 4th place on day 4, the longest stage of the race, when the sky changed color. Sandstorm doesn't arrive like rain, it arrives like a wall. Within minutes, Prosperi was blind, wrapped in a yellow storm that scoured his skin like sandpaper and swallowed every landmark he'd used to navigate. He turned his back to the wind, wrapped a scarf around his face, and waited it out, crouched low so the dunes wouldn't bury him alive. 8 hours, that's how long it lasted. When it finally stopped, the world Prosperi woke up in the next morning wasn't the world he'd fallen asleep in. The storm hadn't just slowed him down. It had rebuilt the desert around him, reshaped the dunes, erased the tracks, deleted every reference point he had. He had a compass. He had a map. Neither of those things matter when the landscape they were drawn for no longer exists. He ran for 4 hours before he let himself admit it. He was lost. Not behind, not off course. Lost. And here is the detail that should chill you. He wasn't panicking yet. He was an athlete. He assumed the organizers would find him within hours. He had no idea that he was about to spend more time missing in the Sahara than most people spend on vacation. The first thing he did was urinate into a spare bottle, not out of desperation, out of training. He remembered his grandfather's stories about soldiers drinking their own urine when the wells ran dry, and he knew that early urine, while the body is still hydrated, is the least harmful to drink. He was rationing a resource he hadn't even needed yet. That's how sure he was that rescue was close. It was not. On the second evening, he heard something that should have saved his life, a helicopter flying low enough that he could see the pilot's helmet through the windshield. He fired his flare. It was barely bigger than a pen standard issue for the race that year, a mistake organizers wouldn't repeat again. The pilot never saw it. The helicopter was simply returning to refuel. It banked away and disappeared, and Prosperi stood there in the dying light, watching the only chance he'd had in 2 days fly straight past him. That's the first time he let himself feel despair. It would not be the last. A day later, he found shelter, a marabout, a small stone shrine where desert travelers stopped to rest. He hoped it would be occupied. Instead, he found a coffin, and inside it, the remains of a holy man. He stayed anyway. A roof, even a dead man's roof, was better than open sky. It was inside that shrine that Prosperi discovered what the desert would actually cost him. Up in the crumbling rafters, he found bats. He caught them by hand, cut them open, and drank what he found inside raw. He would eat more than 20 of them before he was done. This is not a detail most retellings dwell on, but it should stop you cold. A decorated athlete, on his knees in a dead man's tomb, keeping himself alive one bat at a time. For 3 days he stayed there, tending a signal fire, waiting. On the 3rd day, he heard an engine, a plane. He threw everything flammable he had onto the fire, his own backpack, his gear, anything that would burn hot and fast. And then, as if the desert itself were mocking him, a second sandstorm rolled in and swallowed the smoke before it ever reached the sky. 12 hours later, when it cleared, the plane was long gone. That was the second time despair found him. This time, it didn't let go. He did the math the way only a methodical mind can. In Italy, a missing person can't be legally declared dead for 10 years, which meant that if he simply vanished into the dunes, his wife wouldn't receive his police pension for a decade. But if his body was found here, in this shrine, there would be no ambiguity, no decade of waiting, just proof. So Prosperi wrote his wife a note in charcoal, lay down on the stone floor, and cut his wrists. 6 days of dehydration had thickened his blood past the point of flowing freely. He didn't bleed out. He simply woke up the next morning, alive and unable to explain why. He described it later not as a rescue, not as luck, but as a sign. Something in him reset. The athlete came back online. He thought about his 3 children. He gathered what strength he had left and made a decision that would define the rest of the ordeal. He was going to walk out of here under his own power, or he wasn't going to make it at all, but he wasn't going to just wait for death to decide for him anymore. Before the race, local guides had told the runners something that sounded almost mystical. If you're ever lost, look for clouds gathering on the horizon at dawn. That's where you'll find water, find life. Set your compass toward them and don't stop. So that's what he did. He picked a direction and started walking. What followed was days of a man reduced to something older than an athlete, something closer to instinct. He killed snakes and lizards with his bare hands and ate them raw, both for food and for the moisture in their bodies. He found dried-out riverbeds where desert succulents still grew, and squeezed them for juice like a man wringing water from a stone. He studied dried animal droppings for clues about which direction held water. His watch grew looser on his wrist with every mile, a quiet, constant reminder of exactly how much of himself the desert was taking. He stopped being able to urinate at all. That's how dry he had become. He kept himself from collapsing with nothing more than anti-diarrheal tablets from his pack and the sheer refusal to stop moving during the cool hours of morning and dusk. By the 8th day, he found a small oasis and drank in slow, careful sips for hours, terrified that gulping the water too fast would kill him after everything else had failed to. Nearby, he found a single footprint in the sand, proof, finally, that another human being had stood exactly where he was standing. On the 9th day, he saw goats in the distance, and then he saw a young shepherd girl who took one look at the blackened, skeletal figure stumbling toward her camp and ran, terrified, to warn the women in her family. There were no men at the camp that day, but the women didn't turn him away. They gave him goat's milk. When they tried to feed him solid food, his body rejected it immediately. He'd gone too long without eating anything real. They wouldn't let him inside the tent, so they laid him in the shade of the veranda and sent word to the nearest military post. When the police arrived, they blindfolded him. They didn't know who he was, only that a half-dead stranger had appeared out of the desert speaking Italian, and in this region that was reason enough for caution. It wasn't until they confirmed his identity that the blindfold came off, and that's when Prosperi learned exactly how far the desert had carried him. He wasn't in Morocco anymore. He had crossed, unknowingly, into Algeria, 291 kilometers off course. 181 miles from where the race had ever intended him to be. At the hospital in Tindouf, when he was finally strong enough to make a phone call, the first words out of his mouth to his wife weren't, "I'm alive." They were a question, had she already held his funeral? After 10 days missing in the Sahara, that was the reasonable assumption. When they weighed him, he had lost 16 kilograms, 35 pounds, off a body that didn't have much to spare in the first place. His liver was damaged. His eyes had suffered permanent harm from the sun and sand. For months afterward, he couldn't keep down anything but soup. It took him almost 2 years to fully recover. Here's the part almost nobody expects. 4 years later, Mauro Prosperi went back. He ran the Marathon des Sables again, and then he ran it again after that, 7 times in total. He told people that when he starts something, he finishes it, and that the desert had gotten into his blood the same way it had almost taken it from him. Search and rescue physiologists have argued for years about whether a human body can really survive what Prosperi says his did, the bat blood, the 9 days without real water, the raw snakes. Some call it exaggeration, but no one disputes the facts that don't require his word alone. He vanished off the marked course, the flares were changed industry-wide because of what happened to him, and he was found, alive, 300 kilometers from where he should have been, inside a country he never meant to enter. What Prosperi's ordeal really exposes isn't about deserts at all. It's about the gap between what we assume our limits are and where they actually sit. Most of us will never know that gap exists because we're never pushed hard enough to find it. He found his by accident, in a sandstorm that lasted 8 hours and rewrote the rest of his life. The line between the people who give up and the people who don't isn't always courage. Sometimes it's something smaller and stranger than that, a body that simply refuses to cooperate with its own ending, buying its owner one more morning to change his mind. Somewhere in Sicily, there's a man in his 70s who still runs the desert every year, on legs that once carried him 300 kilometers past the edge of death and back. He'll tell you the worst part was never the heat. The worst part was the 8 hours. It took a storm to erase every reason he had to believe he'd make it home, and the 9 days it took him to prove the storm wrong. If you want more true stories like this, people pushed further than they ever thought possible, subscribe because there's another one coming soon. Thanks for watching.